Hello, everyone. Welcome and happy Friday. And Friday means one of the coolest guests that we have in the community. We bring from enterprise software community, anybody from ERP, CRM. So for today, we are going to have very special guest. He's going to introduce himself. But before we do that, a couple of things from the logistics perspective. This is the series that we do every Friday between 8 to 11 a.m. Eastern, depending upon the availability of the guest. Sometimes their time zone is a problem. So keep an eye on these episodes. These are very specific. We don't do every Friday, but whenever we find really compelling guests that we really want to have, then we are bringing them on. So look for the announcement. We generally announce these webinars much in advance, a month. If you have not subscribed to our newsletter, that's where you are going to find details about these things if you don't want to miss any of these episodes. On that note, Chris, welcome. And do you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, great to be here, Sam. So my name is Chris Rolls. I run TTC Global in North Americas. And what we do is we're a software testing quality engineering consultancy. And in particular, we do a lot of work helping organizations implement, ERPs, CRMs, HCMs, and so on. So really excited to be here today. I love your podcast.
Okay, amazing. And I love your work and your company, the kind of work that you are doing. So we are going to peel layers into that. Before that, if you are in the audience, we are always big fan of this three-way conversation. I know that we two are in the room, but you are actually in the room as well. Okay, so keep your stories live. If you have any sort of experiences, either with TTC Global, positive, negative, whatever it is, comment. And these guys do a lot of work in the S4 space. So if you are going to have any related experiences or the stories that you might be able to share, we will be discussing, we'll be talking with you as we move along with the episode. On that note, Chris, so let's peel some layers here, right? So, and that's my favorite topic. I mean, that's what I like to do. So one of the things that I hear in the community, okay, so ERP, especially in the mid-market, I don't know if enterprises are going to be different. From my experience working even with enterprises, S4 and automated testing, they are generally not used in the same sentence in my personal experience.
Yeah.
So tell me if you have different experiences.
Yeah, I think for sure that is automated testing is relatively low in S4 and SAP in general when you compare it to, let's say, more digital systems, right? I would say that's changing. I would say that's increasing a bit because what people are realizing is when you go to S4, that's like a big project in and of itself, but then the release cadence increases after go live, right? And if you're just trying to do everything via manual testing, it just becomes too much for you and the burden is too high. So a lot of people are trying to make that shift now to do more automated testing. How successful they are, that's another story. But yeah, it's increasing, but from a fairly low base.
Yeah, I love how honest you are, even when that's the business that you are in, right? So, so let's do a little, I call this as more of the psychographic analysis of your customers. So some people get it, some people don't. Obviously, I mean, you are not a teenager anymore, I guess, that you don't know what you are doing. So obviously you're running a decent sized business. So there's a clear value in it, right? And some businesses realize that, especially the ones, and I don't know if this is good, these are going to be the people who have done this multiple times and they know how much value it can bring. So give me a flavor of, which customers get it, which customers don't, and what is the barrier for their understanding?
So, yeah, we work with customers from sort of small, mid-sized businesses all the way up to some of the largest companies in the world, the Fortune Global 5, right? If I sort of go into this a little bit, when organizations first start to implement like a large system like ERP, how do they do testing? Usually, they just throw it over to the business or their power users at the end and they do some business acceptance testing or some user acceptance testing, right? And quite often organizations go through like a maturity journey, right? So they do their first project, they say, well, man, that was quite hard. Like, let's document some of the test cases. And then they have a test suite that they go through that. Some of the test cases are good, some of the test cases are not good. And then over time, they start to learn all these lessons and they say, okay, maybe we should automate some of this. Maybe we don't want to have like our business people taking so much time out of their day to do this testing. Maybe we need to get a little bit smarter about how we do our testing. So typically, the organizations who really invest in test automation are those who've got the battle scars.
Yeah.
Part of what we try and do is say, hey, you don't need to go through this multi-year cycle of learning with this.
Yeah.
We've got the best practices. We've seen what works for companies outside in industry. We can help you kind of jumpstart that.
Yeah, so very interesting. So let's go back to your comment. You mentioned that some companies may be successful, some companies might not be successful. So what are some of the trends that you are seeing that why are they not successful at times? And again, I'm going by your own honest comment that are they not doing enough preparation or what's going on here?
Yeah, so first of all, in the past, I'd say it's partly been tooling, right? So if we look at some of the challenges as it relates to test automation for a ERP like SAP, right?
Yeah.
They tend to be more technically complex to automate than maybe a more simple web application, for example, right? So if you've ever looked below the, let's say Oracle EBS, Oracle Fusion, or SAP, Fiori, you've looked at the HTML structure of those web applications, it's very technical. It's very tough to automate. So that's one thing that prevents a lot of people from doing it. The other thing is they're just complex systems in themselves, right? They're like usually very long, complex end-to-end business processes. You've got a lot of data dependencies. And so there's a lot of technical challenges that you have to resolve there as well.
Yeah.
So what I've seen is that those are probably the two key reasons technically why organizations don't succeed. The other, now I'd say that's become a lot better with some of the tools that are out there in the market today. The other thing really is it comes down to what is the level of executive support for a test automation initiative, right?
Yeah.
I've seen some test automation initiatives have some level of success from the ground up. However, if it's not supported by the whole IT organization, you're always going to fail, right? So now that it's getting a little bit more prominence, CIOs, CTOs, they're starting to understand and see the importance when they move to a higher release cadence.
Yeah.
We're seeing more teams empowered to do the level of automation that will actually help.
Yeah, so very interesting. And this is my personal experience as well, to be completely honest, okay? And, we cover many grounds. Obviously, we are in the ERP space. We also help from the strategy perspective, I guess, in the web app space as well. And one of the joke, I guess, is going to be that, if I'm talking to any customers in pure play web app space, the comment that you mentioned, if I'm going to say, you know what, I don't have automated testing in scope.
Yeah.
They are going to say, you know what? Elevate IQ, you are fired right now.
Yeah.
Don't get it, right? So, and this is going to be for anybody. Let's say you are going to be a CIO, you are going to be IT manager, and if you are going to not talk about automated testing or not have appreciation for that,
the
conversation is not going to go anywhere, I guess, because in 2025, it's given that people would appreciate that. That's not the same thing with the ERP community, right? So you are going to have follow-up comments, and then I'm going to have more, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, as you were saying that, one of the trends that I've seen recently, which I think has been quite positive, for example, one of my customers, a large energy company, they've taken someone more from that sort of digital web space where they're, highly mature, using DevOps principles, automated testing, integrated, releasing at a high cadence.
Yeah.
People are coming over from those sort of teams into the ERP teams, and that's helped drive some acceptance.
Yeah.
Not just of test automation, but other sort of more mature software delivery practices, and adoption of those practices, right? So that's one trend that I've been seeing recently, which has been positive. What I would also say is for sure, like it's definitely a lot easier when you've got a simple standalone web application, even the tools that are available to you, being able to mock and stub out all of the other integrated systems, refresh data more easily. All of these things make it a lot easier to take a true DevOps approach. Now, that's not to say that you can't take a true DevOps approach with an ERP like SAP. You can. It just takes a bit more sophistication about the approaches and techniques as well as the tools that you have available to you.
Yeah, so very interesting. So, I mean, I am not too sure, personally, okay, about the DevOps for ERP. That could be a little challenging because of the challenges that you have from the financial rollout perspective. It's not meant to be a technical system, I guess. So I'm not too sure about DevOps, but I'm definitely very convinced. In fact, sometimes I'm shocked that why, even for our project, sometimes we struggle to convince our customers to be, I'm going to be completely honest here, that, why we should not be doing or including automated testing. And I'll tell you our own reservations, okay?
Yeah, sure.
So one of the things always is, especially in the mid-market, the budget is just so tight, okay? And if you are going to do anything related to automated testing, even though deep down in my heart, I know that you are going to have savings over time, but creating a business case around that could be a little challenging, especially if the customers, if they have not done the automated testing in the past, or they just don't seem to have appreciation for that. It's just a very challenging conversation. And we have had a lot of episodes on this podcast as well with a lot of people, and I'm going to peel layers into that as well. And we have had, and I think you mentioned that as well, related to the whole data dependency piece. So we are going to talk about that, right? But overall, I guess, DevOps, I'm not too sure if DevOps is going to have a play unless your system is going to be, or the state of architecture is going to be super customized for those custom pieces. It might make sense, but not too sure about the ERP. If you are going to have sequential rollout, sequential release of the features, I guess. So I spoke a lot there. So you are going to have some follow-ups there, right?
So we can talk about the DevOps side more, but when it comes to justifying automated testing or a more mature testing approach, I agree. Like, I've seen a lot of people struggle with it. And I think really what you do need is you need a champion who believes in it. But let me tell you about a customer that I work with where we did do a business justification for it, which was really, really compelling. Before I say that, there's lots of different statistics out there, but particularly when you're doing a large ERP system, often testing can be a huge amount of the overall project time and budget, right? So some of the statistics I've seen have been 30% or more, right? Now that's obviously going to vary depending on your organization and so on, but that's in line with what I see at some large organizations. Now with this particular customer, so they, I would say they had like a low to mid-level maturity of their sort of testing practices. They had a test management tool, they stored their test cases, they didn't have test automation, and they're doing an S4 migration with a global rollout, right? So I think they're doing sort of North America, then South America, then rest of the world, right? When they started to look through their project plan, this is a large organization, so I think this was going to take 18 to 24 months off the top of my head for the whole program. And, they had a pretty significant spend on that migration in the realm of like $1 to $2 million, right? And when they looked at it, they said, well, at the end of each rollout phase, we've got this big testing phase, right? And particularly in the latter phases, when they've done all of their customization, the testing phase actually took up the majority of the individual rollout phase, right? So they said, okay, we've got to be smarter about how we do our testing here. We started to engage with them. We did what we call a maturity assessment just to see, okay, what are you doing right now? How can you do it better? And put together a plan leveraging test automation. But also there's another thing we do, particularly with SAP, called impact analysis, decreasing the amount of tests that you actually have to do, because a lot of times people just test everything they can think of, right? And they over test because they're worried. So these two things, as well as a few others, we're actually able to shorten the entire project or program by 6 months, right? So if you look at the business justification of that, just some high level numbers,
Yeah.
$1 to $2 million a month, you're saving $6 to $12 million by doing that, right? So I think if you're looking to justify test automation just on the cost saving of your testing effort,
Yeah.
you probably maybe get break even in a single project.
Yeah.
If it's a multiple phase, the ROI is going to look better. And then also, if you look at it, can we shorten the overall project and all of the associated costs with that? That's when the value proposition and the ROI looks really compelling.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And we are going to talk a little bit more. But before that, we have one of the comment that we are going to address. So here, Anders is saying, I can imagine two, roots testing could go in these scenarios, API driven, which would be well-defined scripts.
Yeah.
Simulated clicking in the UI, which do you see large corporations using? Chris, do you want to address that?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that's a great question. Conceptually, I use what we call like the test automation pyramid. So that basically says the majority of your tests should be at the unit layer, right?
Yeah.
Then next layer would be your API tests, and then on top you would have your UI tests. So the core message of that is that you should have both. You should have a balance between the two. And really what you should be thinking about is what is the intent of each test? And by that, I mean, some things, if it's just when I do this order, I get this data returned, then you can test that via an API. Sometimes though, you might want to test what is the user experience, right? Or the end-to-end flow between different systems, which maybe don't have well-defined APIs. So think carefully about what your intent of your test is. You should have a mixture of both.
Yeah, no, very, interesting comments there. And thank you so much, Anders. I don't know if you are going to have any sort of follow-ups there. We would love to address that. So Chris, now I'm going to go back to my personal challenge overall, right? With respect to the whole ERP, and ERP is a beast. We all know this. Anything around ERP is going to be extremely hard, primarily because of the data tightness and the business rules that you have. It's just a nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
A simple web app is always easy from the development, DevOps, unit testing, all the principles that you are going to have, they sort of apply there. Now, one of the things that I always joke about, with my customers, is that, what I am a big fan of whenever you are trying to automate anything, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I always ask them, okay, you want to automate this? Okay, do me a favor. Create the software first on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And they're like, you are out of your mind. Why the hell did I hire you? You want me to create this software on a spreadsheet?
Yeah.
What is your job then? I'm going to say, look, buddy, we are trying to streamline something here. If you don't have a model, then you would not be able to automate that. A software is not going to work. You are going to have scalability challenges later on. That's why this exercise is going to help you. Now, one thing that my personal challenge, okay? And this is what I teach my teams as well. We struggle a lot.
Yeah.
ERP test cases, okay? Just writing the damn thing on a spreadsheet is hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure.
Because so many dependencies, and that's what you were talking about, like just documenting those test cases.
Yeah.
It's very hard. And then we realize that, what? It's not going to work. I'll let you test and then document.
Yeah. Yeah. That is 100% true. And what you find often is that, look, if you know the system really well, there's a whole bunch of sort of assumptions that you've built into your kind of like 2-line test case, right? Yeah. A whole bunch of knowledge that you have. And so you just go through and you say, okay, I just want to do this. But I have to do this, and this first, and then I do this part here. Whereas if you go and try and automate it, there's a whole, when you're doing it kind of manually, there's a whole bunch of implied information there, right? But when you are doing an automated test case, you really need to have all that information be explicit, right? Particularly if you're having people do the automation who don't have all that implied information that's sitting there. So what we find as well is often sitting down and automating test cases, this can be a good thing, also a very painful thing, because it helps draw out all these assumptions that are sitting in your test cases. And then the final thing I'll say is, when you have a whole bunch of hidden information, I'm not a big fan of every single thing in a manual test case needs to be documented to the nth degree. But sometimes the lack of documentation there means that people don't actually know what the intent of the test that they have there is, right? They just go through and they do something and it kind of works, but is it really testing what was originally intended? So that is for sure one of the biggest problems when automating. And if any of my team are watching this, I'm sure they'd be sitting there going, yep, that is super, super painful for us, for sure.
Yeah, so maybe try to provide a little bit specific examples in terms of, how you guys handle these test cases, because let's say if some customers are trying to figure this out, right?
Yeah.
So I can see value where you said, especially in your story, where you have the multi-phase rollout, multiple entities, some data points are going to change. But then, last time when I was speaking to a very similar company on another episode, I guess, they were doing this in the Microsoft ecosystem. And the only thing I could get from that conversation was that they were trying to only test the custom components. They were not doing the real, the data testing, which is far more relevant in the ERP community. So here, let's say if I were to ask you to describe the process, from my perspective, if I'm cutting the check here, I'm the CFO, my hope is going to be that, I'm going to create my test stub. I have my 18 entities. Okay, I don't want to work hard. Nobody wants to do that. Right? That is their first preference. So my vision and goal is going to be that, I'm going to create this test stub. Okay, I have already created this for entity number 1. Okay, this is now successfully deployed. Now I should be able to reuse this test stub for my 18 other entities. And I can almost guarantee that approach is probably not going to work. And I don't know if you agree with me or not. So how do you approach the scalability aspect of the test stub?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is selecting which test cases you want to automate is probably one of the key decisions that you go through. And what I've seen a lot of people in a lot of organizations get wrong, and it is quite a challenging conversation sometimes we have to have, is they say, well, I just want to do these 100 test cases, right? Well, is there a level of reusability with those test cases? Because if there's a low level of reusability, then the return on investment is going to be much worse, right? If, for example, you have something where, look, 20% of my test cases are the same steps repeated, well, that's going to be much easier to automate, and then you're going to get a much better return, which is going to create an impetus to do more, right? So the first thing to do is to say, what tests are we going to automate that are going to give us the most return or the most bang for our buck, and don't pose a huge amount of technical challenges, right? So you talked a little bit about data-driven testing. So that can be one situation where it's a really good use case. Now, the situation of doing the same test across 18 different warehouses, sometimes that poses some particular challenges that may or may not be good. But conceptually, if you have a same test case, the same test which is going to be replicated 18 different times during a rollout period, but maybe with some different input data, right? That can be a very valuable set of tests to automate, because the effort required for each additional one is lower, right? So you still get the same return on each execution, but the effort required to set it up is lower. So we typically spend a lot of time up front trying to be smart about what you automate, so that you get that return.
Okay, very interesting. So we are going to discuss some scenarios, and these are the same scenarios that we had discussed in the other episodes as well, and hopefully you can offer. So let's say, again, if I'm the CFO, I'm trying to figure out, okay, which are going to be my 100
Yeah.
test cases.
Mhm.
So obviously I need to make that decision, right? So
Yeah.
from the ERP perspective, the way process works, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know where that boundary is going to be. So maybe you can talk about that. But overall, the way, so let's say if I'm rolling out my entities, right? So first what you need to do is you are going to have some sort of financial entity, you are going to have some sort of calendar, you need to set up all of that, you need to configure, make sure that you are able to input your transactions. So you need to have the basic setup. Now from the tester perspective, let's say if I go to my web app example, okay,
Yeah.
generally the way web apps work is they can start from very empty database. They can, in fact, sometimes, they can literally create the database as well.
Mhm.
The foundational setup that you are going to need to be able to perform your transactions, because
Yeah.
those are going to be the dependencies that
Yeah.
your test hub is going to require. So here, are you literally setting the entities and then financial calendar and then chart of accounts, and is this all happening through APIs? And then finally, let's say if I'm doing my first transaction in that entity, then am I doing first sales order,
Yeah.
verifying if the invoice is created? Are you doing all of that or something different?
Yeah, no. So we talk about the preconditions to the actual test, right? And a big part of the preconditions is the test data. We divide it up into 3 different categories.
Okay.
We call it synthetic. So if it's something sort of temporary that we can create, right? So we might actually create the data ahead of the test. Now, that's not always possible, right? Like if you're talking about SAP, you might have some master data which you can't just create. You can't just like spin up for the test and then delete it, right? So then we also talk about sometimes queried data. So we might query it to then say, okay, you need a warehouse that has got this particular set of characteristics, which I need for my test, right? And then we also do have what we call static data. So we just assume that this particular warehouse, for example, is there. And if it's not there, then our test is going to break. But, it's going to be, that's something that has a long shelf life, right? So going into it, in our preconditions, the prerequisite data that we need, we either create it, or we query it, or we kind of hard code it and assume that is there. Obviously, we want to minimize how much we're hard coding.
Yeah.
And so the preference is for sort of created data or queried data.
Yeah, so very interesting. So now let's say you go back to, and I don't know how many engagements you are doing per year and how many years you have been in this business. So let's say if you were to just draw some sort of pattern in these engagements, right? So maybe talk about some of the differences in those engagements. I don't know if some of these engagements were more challenging than the other. There is always a possibility, right? So talk about some of those stories, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, some of them were more challenging than one of the things I said before. So the first thing is that having the right champion, having the right support for these initiatives is absolutely crucial. All of the engagements that I can look at where I say that was a super successful engagement has had an engaged and an enthusiastic champion, right? Because when you're an outside organization coming in to drive any kind of change, there's only so much power you have, right? If the whole organization is against it and doesn't want to do it, then you're not going to be successful. That's just a reality. Like no matter how technically good you are, it's like implementing an ERP system. If no one in the company wants to implement an ERP system, no matter how good you are at your job, it's not going to happen. Someone's going to find a way, right?
Yep.
So an engaged and enthusiastic champion is absolutely critical. Then I think some of the other things that make it successful are access to subject matter experts within the organization, kind of the power users to answer questions. Particularly when it comes to SAP, our team will come in and our team has a solid understanding of SAP, right? And has been in these sorts of engagements before, but there's always going to be things about your particular instance, your particular customizations, your rules, and so on internally that we're going to have to ask, right? We can make some assumptions, but there's usually going to be questions we have. So those are some of the things from like a client side. Then from our side, we do a lot of things around how we develop our automation. And so there's been a few situations where we've come in to sort of do rescue cleanup, and usually the thing that people get wrong is they build their automation and they focus on number of test cases, right? So I don't care whether you've got 100 test cases, 1,000, 10,000. The question is, are you using it? Are they finding defects? Is it giving you value, right?
Yeah.
And so when people get really caught up into the quantity of the test cases rather than the quality of the test cases, that's when they get problems. So when we do it, we focus really on, okay, build it once, build it really good, continue to run it during their development process so that it's really mature, right? So those are some things. I could go on and on, but yeah.
So, Chris, now we are going to do a little fun exercise here, okay?
Yeah.
So for the next maybe 5 minutes, you are going to be a teacher, okay?
Okay.
You are going to teach something here. So I'm going to give you a story and the scenario, and you can ask any sort of clarifying questions if you have. Sometimes it might be harder to sort of get the hang of the story, right? And then you are going to teach in terms of how to think from the testing mindset. In my personal experience, that is one of the hardest to teach anyone, okay? Now, I'm pretty sure you have come across these guys, pretty much everybody. In 2025, if you ask, okay, who's the ERP consultant? Pretty much everybody is going to raise their hands. Everybody is ERP consultant these days, right? Now, if you ask them, okay, you are ERP consultant, great idea. Now, let's review your test cases. So this is the story that I'm talking about. And, this is very similar to what you were talking about, I guess, as well, in terms of quantity versus quality of these test cases. So in this particular instance, they had a test case, okay? And obviously they had a lot of issues. They were complaining that nothing is working, everything is breaking. We are fixing something and that is breaking something else. Fun exercise, right? I mean, when you don't know how to test, I guess, then you are going to have all of these issues. So then we started digging into things. Okay, what's happening? And the first thing always is, okay, have you done any sort of testing? Show us your test cases. And sometimes they want us to review the test cases as well. And in the test cases, generally my expectations are very low. 90% of the ERP consultants that I have worked with, and this is going to be my hiring interview question as well, that okay, show me if you can organize your test cases. And in 90% of the cases, none of the ERP consultants can do that, right? So, if I find somebody who's going to do that, that's my superstar. Going back to the story. In this particular case, when I'm looking at the test case, I'm noticing that they have mentioned something like create 2 sales orders. Create 2 sales orders, okay? And I'm like, okay, what are you trying to test? Are you trying to test creation of sales orders in an ERP? I mean, that any ERP can create, I guess. So what exactly are you trying to test here? And why 2? And they were like, no. I mean, we need to have a lot of test cases, We need to test a lot. Otherwise, it's going to break. What exactly are you trying to test here? So now the question, and going back to the whole story, I guess, people don't know how to test.
Correct.
People just don't have those skills, and they don't realize how difficult it is to master those skills unless you have done this for a very long time. If any users is claiming that they have testing skills, they are absolutely wrong.
So I think you asked what's the purpose of the test. I always call it the test intent, right? What are you intending to test? I think the biggest confusion that people have around testing is that it is just performing some actions in a system. That's not what it is, right? That's using the system. And the challenge, particularly when it comes to ERPs, is that most of the time the people doing the testing have come from the business and they're not trained as sort of professional testers. So the first thing you should always think about when you're designing a test, even if you're not writing it down, even if you're just going into the system, is what is the intent of the test? What am I trying to achieve? Like your example about the sales orders. Are they doing 2 sales orders because further down the line they need to see that these 2 sales orders interact in the right way? Are they doing it because they had an issue in the past where if you gave 2 sales orders the same name, the system broke? It could be so many different things. Are they just doing 2 sales orders because they want to double the amount of tests, right? I don't know. So what is the intent of your test? And you should think about your tests in some ways, or testing that you do, as almost like an experiment to try and elicit some unexpected behavior from the system, right? So you have kind of a hypothesis. If I create the sales order, then these sort of things happen, right? You are doing an experiment in some ways to see how the system performs and whether it performs to your expectations or whether it violates them. And I think that's fundamentally the biggest thing that people get wrong. They just go, do, I'm on the keyboard, I'm doing something, and away we go. But yeah, and then when it comes to documenting it, I like people to be explicit. Even if this is the only line they write, I like them to be explicit about the test that they are trying to perform, right? So, create a sales order to see that it effectively flows through the downstream systems. Now, if all you do is you write that, that's going to be a better test case than if you just say create 2 tests, 2 sales orders, then go into the system, because you don't know what they're trying to achieve. So
yeah, very interesting. So now we are going to do one more scenario, and hopefully you can teach something, right? So here, and this is your comment related to, hey, spend more time in the unit testing, and that is compliant with any recommendation that anybody is going to have, who's even remotely seasoned, I guess, right? That detect things early in the process so that you can avoid later headaches, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So let's say in the ERP world, it's always challenging. If you go back to your programming world, it's easier to understand that, okay, you have some sort of, Java code, JavaScript, .NET. I don't care which programming language is that. It's just easier. You have a bunch of classes, methods, whatever. You write a test case and, you try to see how the unit tests are working, right?
Yeah.
And then you have a little bit of integration, user testing. Now, in the ERP world, thinking from the unit testing could be difficult because of so many different dependencies.
Correct.
So how do you think about that? How do you isolate? Okay, so maybe provide some sort of example, let's say in the sales order. What would be a unit test? How would you segment? How would that correlate with slightly bigger test, I guess, and then user acceptance and the business case test?
Yeah, so I think first of all, one clarification that I have in the sort of ERP world, like SAP, for example, is sometimes when I talk about unit testing, I'm meaning code level unit testing. Because sometimes within SAP, people talk about unit testing and they talk about like functionally testing a unit, right? So let's just clarify, when I talk about unit testing, I'm talking about code level unit testing. Now, I'll say with SAP in particular, I'm not a SAP developer, but I have seen more and more people doing unit testing, like ABAP unit test and so on. So I've seen like a reasonable level of success with that, but that's not really my area of expertise, right? What you would do if you work a little bit up from the unit test level, like our friend Anders was saying in the chat, you might want to isolate some parts of the system and do some API testing to like a more component level test. And then you place your UI test on top.
Okay, very interesting. And that's my perception as well. And that's what I got from the other conversation, when we had this in the Microsoft ecosystem. And they were also doing the technical unit testing, meaning if you are going to have any sort of customizations. And in the Microsoft ecosystem, you generally have a lot more customization just because the community is very technical. To be completely honest, sometimes, I mean, from my perspective, they are probably going to be unnecessary. So that's where I have seen the importance of testing. So it seems like we are agreeing on that unit testing is
Correct.
not going to be as much relevance in the ERP community, right?
Yeah, I think you have to think, again, it goes back to the intent of your testing. So if you've got custom code, that's where you will typically be doing your unit testing, right?
Yeah.
I think what also makes it difficult is with ERP systems in general, it's not just actual code you're writing, sometimes it's configuration. So it's kind of, you can't really unit test that in the same way as if you were coding the whole system up from scratch. So yeah, you've got to be a little bit more selective. And this is where, if we talk about sort of the digital world and taking DevOps principles, you can take the principles, but you can't just take all of the practices, right? It's a fundamentally different system. It's architected in a completely different way for a completely different purpose, right? So you've got to think through from first principles. Does this make sense to unit test or not? Sort of similarly, what I've also seen some organizations do wrong is they've then said, oh, we need to have unit tests for everything. And then you've got to go, well, does that really make sense? And sometimes the answer is no.
Yeah, so very interesting. So now let's talk about some of the technologies. And I don't know if you guys have had any sort of challenges. And sometimes, I mean, when you look at testing, you are sort of dependent upon the underlying technology as well. Okay, if you are simply testing using browser, now we have come a long way. Obviously, we can do a lot now. AI agents is, I don't know, and we can talk about AI probably in the next segment. But so let's say if you compare this with slightly more legacy technologies, which are going to be very on-prem. And sometimes, I mean, even though I have very technical background, I struggle to understand, how these systems are enabled. Sometimes they are going to be lift and shift, and I don't know how easy it is going to be to even parse. Because, if you look at, and generally, the way most of the web technologies or these scrapers, the way they work is, you are going to have some sort of HTML code. They are trying to grab a piece of data from that, and they are trying to sort of validate that, right? But sometimes that code is not available because, and I don't know how they do it, to be completely honest. Maybe you can teach me. So have you seen any sort of challenges from the technology perspective as well with some of these legacy systems? Maybe they are on-prem, running using VPN or whatever.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, one of the other technical challenges that you have is you might be talking about an ERP, whether it's, Microsoft Dynamics or SAP, Oracle, but these systems don't exist in isolation, right? These systems are almost always integrated. And a big part of the testing that you're doing, because if you think, where do defects come from in an ERP system? Like, it's customization, configuration, integration, and then often data issues, right? So you want to test these integrations between different systems. And that creates a whole lot of new technical challenges, right? Because, maybe you're SAP, but then maybe you're integrated with Salesforce, or maybe you're integrated with a mainframe system, or the different possibilities are kind of endless, right? And so one thing you don't really want to do, in my opinion, is, particularly with an ERP, which is central to your whole IT landscape, is use test automation tools that only work on the web browser, right? Or only work on your on-prem, desktop application. So in an ideal world, you take a tool which can automate every single application which is integrated. So then you can look at that all holistically, right? So that's one thing. To kind of go into how do these different tools work, usually there's some application programming interface which these tools will be looking at, and like in a browser they'll go, okay, they'll be able to get a representation of all of the objects in the DOM, right? The domain object model. You'll then look at like your technical identifiers, and usually you'll use like one or combination of different technical identifiers, say the ID, or maybe you might use something like an XPath or something like that to identify the control in the DOM.
Okay, so very interesting. So now let's compare these testing tools, and I don't know, how they have evolved. Obviously, you are going to have a lot more background because you are tracking these tools on a daily basis. You are probably trying to improvise your own processes as well, right? And things are changing, and they are changing very rapidly, right? So one of the overlaps, at least in my mind, when I look at this, RPA is a very compelling technology,
Correct.
and I don't know if that is being used in the similar use cases. They can do very similar things. They
Yep.
are interacting with very similar technical platforms.
Yep.
Are you seeing any sort of overlap? Do you know if automated testing companies, and I don't know how good they are doing overall from the market share perspective.
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk about this market and maybe RPA market, and if there is any overlap that you have seen.
Yeah, correct. So in a lot of ways, they're conceptually very similar tools, right? Because they automate interactions with the system. So we do see some RPA tools, for example, UiPath, right? They really push their testing side of things. We have seen some testing tools as well go into RPA. In fact, we've even seen customers who use like testing tools to do RPA work, even though maybe they weren't specifically designed to do that, right? So I think conceptually they're quite similar. I think at a C level, there's a desire to have the same tool, right? Because you don't want to be paying for both tools. But in practice, what I've seen is that it's the features around the tools, not just the core automation piece of it, but other features around it that lend towards a testing platform being preferred for testing and an RPA platform being preferred for RPA. So for example, like the ability to manage all of your test cases and get analytics and reports, that's still better in the testing platforms than the RPA ones.
Okay, so very interesting. So now let's, and I don't know how comfortable you are going to be in naming some of the names, and I'm actually interested in that, right? And I don't know who holds the license for these testing tools. Is it going to be generally customer, or are you providing those licenses? Because that itself could be a spend, I guess, for the customer as well. So let's say if you were to propose some sort of tech stack, okay, how many different tools do you need? What are the pros and cons? So give me some lay of the land in terms of the testing tools.
So if we're talking specifically about SAP, I think it's actually super clear. There's Tricentis is the leader in that space, and they're actually endorsed and supported by SAP. So that would be my number one recommendation there.
So why are they? So let's say if I were to ask you, okay, why is that a preference? Are there any pros and cons? Are they tightly integrated? What's going on here?
Yeah, so actually, from what I understand, SAP even uses Tricentis to test their own products, right? So they're very tightly integrated from an R&D perspective. They've got, I was talking about the ability to support across multiple technologies. They do that very well. Then if I'm talking about a platform approach as well, so within the SAP landscape, there's this thing called change impact analysis, which allows you to narrow down the scope of your testing. So Tricentis supports that, as well as having a test management tool, as well as having a performance testing tool, and as well as having a data integrity testing tool as well. So all of that within the same, sort of family or the same platform is one of the reasons why it's particularly strong there. So for the most part, when I see organizations doing SAP testing in particular, they go for Tricentis these days. There's some other things as well, like it's a lower code version of testing, so it's a bit easier for non-technical people to understand. But yeah, that's a short answer.
And do you have any other tools other than Tricentis, or
there's a lot of tools out there. So like kind of for a long time, the biggest tool out there was now owned by OpenText. So it was previously Micro Focus, previously HP, Unified Functional Tester. That's probably the long-standing one. I don't see as many customers moving to UFT these days. Usually it's people with existing licenses who are continuing to use it. There's a player called Worksoft, which has a very heavy focus on SAP. I would say both of those don't have quite the same platform play. They make up for it in some ways with integrations with other tools outside of their ecosystem, but not the same sort of single platform. And then, we mentioned UiPath before. We see UiPath, but my experience so far has been that UiPath is not as strong on testing. They're building testing functionality on top of an RPA product, right?
Yeah, so very interesting. And I didn't realize that open text was in this market as well. Their role, my understanding was that they were more into the document exchange, scenarios, a little bit of EDI, I would say, right?
Yeah.
So how does this relationship go? Because obviously open text is very well aligned with SAP, I guess. They are very well recommended, and there's Tricenter. So give me the politics there, I guess.
Yeah, so I think, well, and I was talking with some people from the SAP BTP team the other day.
Yeah.
I think how they would describe it is, yes, they've got these partners which have overlapping and competitive tools, but their sort of SAP Solex partnership is specifically related to one section of them, right? So they'll say, okay, Tricentis is our tool for testing. OpenText is our tool for this area. UiPath fits in this area. So I think when you get to the day-to-day, sometimes the sales reps from individual companies will make that partnership seem more broader. But that's how I understand it.
Yeah, no, this is fun. So now let's go back to our AI conversation,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
And the evolution. And I don't know if you're going to have any sort of forecast from the trend perspective. So obviously AI is changing a lot. AI is phenomenal. There's no question. There is real power here. And one of the powers I personally see is probably going to be in autonomous testing. Are you seeing anything that these companies might be working on? Give me the vendors who are like super top. They have already announced, they have the product ready.
So as with every area with AI at the moment, it is challenging still to sift through and see the hype from the reality, right? So when we talk about AI, we talk about it in three different ways. We talk about AI-powered testing tools. And so that's the first thing that most organizations want to talk to us about. They say, I want to drive efficiency in AI and testing using AI, right? What are the tools out there in the market? The second thing we talk about is actually testing AI systems themselves. Like, these are still systems, you still need to test them. And in fact, because it's such a revolutionary technology, and because it's less well understood, my argument is that you need to test them more, because you don't want, I mean, we've all seen the things on LinkedIn and everything where, people trick the chatbots to tell them that, the car is worth only $1 and they can purchase it for that amount. There's huge risks associated with this for organizations. So how do you test these systems? And then finally, how do you truly become AI ready? And there's a lot of conversations about, for example, the quality of your data. If you're applying machine learning across your data, you want to make sure your data is of a high quality, right? So just big picture, we talk about those three different areas of AI. When it comes to AI within testing, we did this analysis of all of the different tools out on the market currently. So we leveraged like Gartner's analysis, but we went beyond that, and we made sure that we used all of the different tools. And what we found is there's a lot of tools out there which they're kind of just getting started, right? So they're newer entrants, they're kind of AI first, and they've got big promises with autonomous testing. Those products aren't quite there yet. The reason being, I think, particularly when you talk about large enterprise systems with AI, it's a lot more difficult than a simple web application, right? So what we found is there's some tools which are kind of in the to watch category for us, and then there's some tools which are, like these incumbent tools which are applying AI on top of their existing products here. And that's what we found is more successful to date for the sort of enterprise landscape.
Okay, so we are close to our time right now, Chris, and I don't know, I mean, this was super fun. I mean, you are super easy to talk to. I didn't even realize that this was an interview, to be completely honest, okay? So now and I'm pretty sure my listeners are feeling the same, to be completely honest, okay? So now, if you're going to have any sort of closing advice for our listeners and any plug that you might have, I mean, go for it.
For sure. So look, if you are looking to modernize your approach to testing for any ERP or sort of enterprise application, the first thing that I would say, it can provide a lot of value, but it does require a bit of work. So the most successful organizations that we've worked with, they do an assessment up front to say, what do they really need? Where are they at currently, right? So for example, when we're working with a Fortune 5 organization to the S4 migration, they said, okay, a year ahead of time, they wanted to start to lay the groundwork for things like automation so that they would be successful. So that's the first thing that I'd say. Get started early, do an assessment. Then I'd say, look, for us, we invest a lot in doing testing of these enterprise applications. We know the best-in-class tools like we were talking about before, but also we've invested in building what we call accelerator packs on top of it, right? So that you don't have to create all of the all of the automated test cases from the ground up. So, love to support your customers, your listeners. Feel free to reach out to me, tdcglobal.com, or you can hit me up on LinkedIn. But yeah.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much once again, Chris, for being here and being generous with your time. And if you joined for the first time, this was part of our podcast series for which we meet every Friday and we bring very exciting guests. So make sure you stay tuned. And generally, the best way to find that is going to be through our newsletter or through my LinkedIn wall. On that note, thanks everyone for tuning in today. You have a wonderful Friday.
Thank you very much, Sam. Have a great day, mate.
You too.